Imagine you have a roof with 36 holes, and that's because we initially identified 36 different contributors to this, 36 different mechanisms by which you have this pullback and this cognitive decline. Well, a drug is an excellent patch for one hole, but you still have to deal with the other 35 holes, and therefore you need to address all these things.
I've treated enough patients with dementia to know that when you get dementia in your 50s, it often progresses much more rapidly than the later onset dementias that we see. And I feel like if I hadn't discovered functional medicine 11 years ago, I feel like, I would have been drooling in a nursing home a long time ago, or possibly not even around anymore.
Welcome to this How to Academy event in association with Mind Health 360 on how to prevent and reverse dementia. Now, if you're here, chances are that you or your loved ones are suffering from dementia or have suffered or at some point will suffer. And I don't need to tell you how devastating the disease can be, as it slowly robs us of our memories, cognitive capacities, it tears apart families, friendships, chips away at what it means to be human, our ability to be present, aware, sentient, rational beings, and to remember our past and connect verbally with others. Now, the bad news is that the numbers of people struggling with dementia worldwide is large, and it's growing. There are over 55 million people currently living with dementia worldwide, nearly 10 million new cases every year. And the number of people living with dementia is expected to double every 5 to 20 years, depending on who you talk to. In the UK, there's 1 in 14 people over 65 who have dementia. And in the US, this number is 6 million, or approximately 1 in 50 of the total population. In the US, dementia kills more people than breast and prostate cancer combined. The other bad news is that there's currently no effective treatment for it. So Alzheimer's, which is actually the most common form of dementia, which accounts for nearly 60 to 70% of dementia cases, the others being vascular, Lewy body, and frontotemporal dementia, is the only one among the 10 most common causes of death in the Western world for which there is no effective pharmaceutical treatment despite years of research into potential drugs. Alzheimer's used to be a one-way street, and as Dr. Bredesen, who's here tonight, says, everyone knows a cancer survivor, but no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. But tonight, we're actually here to discuss the good news, and I'm really excited to be introducing the legendary neurologist, Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's author of the New York Times bestsellers, The End of Alzheimer's and The End of Alzheimer's Program, which are fantastic, fantastic books. And his wonderful research colleague, functional medicine psychiatrist, Dr. Toups, who's author of the upcoming book, which we're all very excited about, called Dementia Demystified. Doctors Bredesen and Toups will tell us tonight about their successes in treating dementia and the results of their latest prospective clinical trial to reverse mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. In this latest study, 84% of their patients showed improvement, which is very, very significant. So we're greatly indebted to Doctors Bredesen and Toups for their life-changing and pioneering work on developing effective solutions for dementia, and we're very grateful to be able to listen to their pearls of wisdom live on how to prevent and reverse this dreadful disease. And after their talks, so they're going to both give 20 minutes talk, we'll be able to ask them questions live, which is fantastic. In terms of their background, Dr. Dale Bredesen graduated from Caltech and received his MD from Duke University. He served as resident and then chief resident in neurology at UCSF, and then he was postdoctoral fellow with Nobel laureate Professor Stanley Prusiner. His Bredesen laboratory has published over 220 research papers into the underlying mechanisms and effective therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease. His work has led to the discovery of subtypes of Alzheimer's disease, followed by the first description of reversal of symptoms in patients with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, with a precision medicine protocol and the recent successful proof of concept trial that I was just mentioning. Dr. Toups is a functional medicine psychiatrist and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, which is the highest honor given out by the APA. as well as a certified practitioner from the Institute of Functional Medicine. She's been practicing psychiatry for almost 30 years and functional medicine psychiatry for the past decade. She's been a featured speaker at national and international medical conferences, podcasts, and summits on dementia and functional medicine psychiatry, as of course has Dale. She's been the principal investigator on over 100 research trials, including more than 20 failed pharmaceutical trials in dementia. So I'm really excited to join with the How To Academy tonight to welcome Dr. Bredesen and Dr. Toups and hear the good news. So thank you both, and you'll both talk for about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Thank you, and we'll start with Dr. Bredesen.
All right, thank you very much, Kirk, and let me just share my slides here. All right, I hope that everyone can see this. So the question is, what can we do to make Alzheimer's optional? As you just heard, this is an extremely common disease. It's on the rise. It is actually now the third leading cause of death in the United States, and this was shown by Professor Christine Yaffe just a couple of years ago. It's actually the #2 cause of death in the UK. So unfortunately, incredibly common and just devastating for families and for patients as well. So there are two major points I want to make in terms of what we can actually do. But before I get started, I think it's important to talk about the semantics of success. We've all heard about the drug that was just approved recently and that led to a number of the expert panel for the FDA actually resigning in protest. And what this drug does in the best case, so here's the best case situation. If you have mild cognitive impairment, which we'll talk about in just a moment, which is pre-Alzheimer's, or if you have Alzheimer's, then on average, you lose about 3.4 points on a 30-point scale per year. Now, the very best, in one trial at one dose, the very best that this new drug, aducanumab, did was it slowed the decline by 22%, but it didn't make people better and it didn't stabilize them. It simply slowed the decline. In other trials, it did not even do that. Now compare that, here is the trial that Kat and I will tell you about today, where in fact there was actual improvement on average for the various people who were in the trial. So this is a fundamental difference in what people are calling success. So for perspective, we've all been dealing with a pandemic, of course, for the last year and a half or so, and now it's killed over 700,000 Americans. But for perspective, Alzheimer's will cause the death of about 50 times as many people. So it's actually a much larger pandemic than the COVID-19 pandemic. And here's the big problem. Whereas COVID-19 is a simple disease, we understand what it is. It's a viral illness. We know about viral illnesses. We can develop antiviral agents. We can develop vaccines. We have sequences. We have sequences for the various variants. And so the fact of the matter is, although it is a horrible illness, in fact, we know what to do about it, and it's being done very effectively in many cases. So in tremendous contrast to this, of course, with Alzheimer's, people don't understand and people argue about what it actually is, the fundamental nature of Alzheimer's. And I think this isn't emphasized enough. It's the fundamental nature of this illness that's actually being missed. So people don't understand what it is. And therefore, we go out and try to make all these anti-Alzheimer's drugs. And we have now over 400 failed clinical trials at a cost of billions of dollars, unfortunately, without any as Kirkland said earlier, without any real successes. So the question is, what is this? And this is what my laboratory group and I looked at for 30 years. What is the nature of this disease, the fundamental nature? We need to develop a model that's consistent with the fact that there are over 150,000 papers published on this, and yet we're not able to predict therapeutic success and failure accurately until now. And I'll show you the difference and why our research really pointed us in the right direction, which is why we were doing this trial with Dr. Kat and Dr. Deborah Gordon and Dr. Anne Hathaway. So one of the problems here is that we wait too long. People talk about mild cognitive impairment, and it's unfortunate that it's gotten the term mild. because this is really something, it's just like saying to someone, don't worry, you only have mildly metastatic cancer. This is actually a relatively late stage of Alzheimer's or other dementia pathophysiology. So it's the third of 4 stages. So the stage 1 is phase 1 is an asymptomatic phase where you can already see changes on PET scan, you can already see changes in spinal fluid. And this occurs about 20 years before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And therefore you can see we really have a tremendous window of opportunity if we simply don't wait. So as I said, abnormal spinal fluid and PET scan. Phase 2 then, which lasts on average 10 years. So again, we have a huge window of opportunity here. Phase 2 is called SCI, or subjective cognitive impairment. And by definition then, you know that there's something wrong, but the cognitive testing is not typically picking it up yet, unless you use very sensitive cognitive testing. So these 2 stages, we have tremendous success with these. Very easy for people who have SCI to reverse their problems if you look to see what's actually causing them. Now, phase 3 out of 4 is what we call mild cognitive impairment. And unfortunately, it's so common for the doctors to say, it's just mild cognitive impairment, come back next year. It really should be called relatively late stage Alzheimer's disease. At that point, the cognitive testing has turned abnormal, and yet you still have your normal activities of daily living. 5 to 10% of people with MCI convert to full-on dementia per year. And then finally, the 4th and final phase is Alzheimer's disease. And this now means that your activities of daily living are affected. And unfortunately, we as physicians and researchers have tried to focus on this 4th and final stage to say, what should we be doing about it? When in reality, we can do much, much better if we go earlier on. And as I said earlier, the diagnosis is typically made about 20 years after the initial biochemical changes. So if we can simply get people to come in earlier for what we call a cognoscopy, just as everybody knows, what do you do when you turn 50? You come in for a colonoscopy to make sure that you're not going to have a problem with colorectal cancer. Same idea here. If you're 45 or over, everyone should have a cognoscopy. Pretty simple to do, some basic blood tests, a simple online cognitive assessment. And then if you're symptomatic already, or if you're doing poorly on the cognitive test, you want to have an MRI with volumetrics. So here's the fundamental problem. Everybody and all the medical practice is centered around simple illnesses, which are what were taking the lives of most people in the 20th century. So if you have pneumococcal pneumonia, for example, having alcohol on board here increases your risk. Having diabetes increases your risk. Having your B cells, these are the ones related to the antibody production. And there are lots of other risk factors for pneumococcal pneumonia. But the pneumococcus itself is so much more important than anything else that we as physicians have gotten away with simply writing you a prescription for ampicillin or penicillin or cephalosporins or what have you. Now, Alzheimer's and other complex chronic illnesses, which is what we are virtually all dying from today, are fundamentally different. It's literally the difference between checkers and chess. So we were dying from checkers illnesses, and unfortunately the doctors are still saying king me as if they're playing checkers. They're not playing chess. And the problem here is if you look at, for example, Alzheimer's disease, insulin resistance is important, various pathogens important, NF-kappa B, which is related to inflammation, mercury, mycotoxins, organic toxins, homocysteine and methylation, and there's a whole flotilla of other things that are critical. But as you can see, not a single one of these is much, much more important than all the others. And therefore, you really need to look, as Kat will show you, you really need to look at the different things for each person to know what to do to get the best outcomes. So I want to just take this down because this is what my laboratory studied for many years. Let's open the hood. Let's look under the hood. What is Alzheimer's? The most fundamental nature of this problem is related to the support of a system within your brain. So there's a molecule here. So this is now, I'm blowing up one of your brain cells. So here is the membrane of the brain cell, and here's one receptor. It's called APP, for amyloid precursor protein, and it's a really remarkable receptor because what it's doing is it's sampling the environment to tell you whether things are good or bad. So this is just like what your president of your country, your prime minister, or the head of your company would be doing. Let's imagine that you are the president of my Brainistan. So, okay, you're now looking at these various things. When things are good, you don't have runaway inflation, you don't have anyone attacking you, you're not in the middle of a pandemic, and you're doing well at the bank and you're doing well in business, okay, then what happens is you send out a message and you say, okay, things are good. Your brain does the exact same thing. It's sampling the environment. When times are good, this molecule is cut at a single site. And by the way, you can follow the molecular pathways. As an example, estradiol binds to its receptor, enters the nucleus of your neuron, and turns on the molecule that cuts right here to say things are good. We can make and keep new interactions. And this is, again, very much analogous to what has happened during the pandemic. We were all told a little over a year and a half ago, pull back, shelter in place, socially distance, don't go to work, all these things. And of course, we entered a recession. And it's the same idea in your brain. When things are bad, you pull back. So things are good, you grow. This is an anti-Alzheimer's direction. But this same molecule, when it senses problems, when there is inflammation, when there are pathogens, when there are toxins, when there's insulin resistance, when there's type 2 diabetes, when there's head trauma, on and on and on, these various insults, it literally switches your brain into a protective downsizing mode. Again, just what happened to our countries when we had the pandemic. So at that point, this same molecule is cut at 3 sites. And again, you can trace the pathways from inflammation to cutting here and here. And here is the amyloid beta that everyone has vilified in Alzheimer's disease. It's only because it's part of a bigger picture. It's saying that you've responded. And by the way, it is a wonderful antimicrobial. It is your own version of penicillin, basically. So it's responding to these various microbes and saying, oh my gosh, I'm under attack. I'm going to make this stuff that kills the microbes. So we don't want to get rid of that stuff. We want to know why you have it to begin with. What's causing your brain to say, I'm under attack? And then we want to address those things. So what this means then, and I apologize for the equation, but the point here is that you can now look at this very, very specifically. Your probability of getting Alzheimer's is proportional to what happens over time from pulling back the bad side I just showed you over the good side. Well, okay, the good news is you can literally look at 4 major areas. Do you have ongoing inflammation from all sorts of things? You can have it from poor dentition. The actual bacteria from your mouth can gain access to your brain, which the pathologists see all the time. Do you have exposure to various toxins? Things like inorganic toxins. Air pollution has turned out to be an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Organic toxins, things like formaldehyde and benzene and toluene and things like that. And then biotoxins, toxins made by things like molds that turn out to be very important. These all increase your risk for dementia. And then on the other side, energetics. Do you have enough support, enough oxygenation, enough blood flow, enough mitochondrial function? These are the little batteries in your cells. Do you have enough ketones? In fact, ketones and glucose are the 2 things that power your brain. And when things are good, you should be able to go back and forth between those 2. And when things are bad, you can't go back and forth between burning those 2. And then finally, trophic support. And that's nerve growth factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor and hormones, estradiol, testosterone, all these things, and then nutrients like vitamin D. So these are the 4 groups of things that we want to identify for each person who has cognitive decline, and then that we actually want to do something about. And what that means is if we were to develop the perfect Alzheimer's drug, and we spent years in the laboratory trying to develop the perfect Alzheimer's drug until we realized this is what it would look like. So this is a tall order for a single drug to be doing all these different things. And I do think pharmaceuticals are going to play a very important role in the long run in optimizing cognition and in reversing cognitive decline. But right now, they don't address a number of these things. So we usually tell the patients, imagine you have a roof with 36 holes. And that's because we initially identified 36 different contributors to this, 36 different mechanisms by which you have this pullback and this cognitive decline. Well, a drug is an excellent patch for one hole, but you still have to deal with the other 35 holes. And therefore, you need to address all these things, identify them and address them. And by doing that, in fact, we have better results than have ever been achieved previously. So I just want to then spend a couple minutes talking about the clinical trial, and I'm very honored to have done this with Dr. Anne Hathaway, Dr. Kat Toups, that you'll hear from in just a couple of minutes, and Dr. Deborah Gordon, just absolutely outstanding physicians who really understand 21st century medicine and look at these appropriate things when, unfortunately, at so many of our memory centers, people are not looking at this. And so what they're telling us is, yeah, it's Alzheimer's. We don't know what causes it. There's nothing to be done for it. Well, yes, if you don't look to see what's causing it, of course, there's nothing to be done with it. So this is the first trial in which, instead of predetermining a treatment, which everybody had done before, say, okay, whenever someone comes in, we're going to give them drug X. Well, no, what we want to do is flip that, and we want to figure out why they have the problem. We actually got turned down back in 2011 and again in 2018, finally got approved in 2019. The trial was completed in 2020. A small proof of concept trial. We're now actively setting up the next trial, which will begin early in the new year. We looked at people who have MoCA scores of 19 or above. What that means is these were people who had mild cognitive impairment, so in other words, the 3rd of 4 stages, or early Alzheimer's disease, the 4th of 4. So these are still people who were fairly far along in the pathophysiology. But we didn't take people who had MoCA scores 0, 5. We have seen some of those people improve, but it's more difficult and less common. So the idea here was to compare personalized precision medicine protocols to historical outcomes. We know a lot from all the trials of what happens to people, as everyone's aware, what happens to people with MCI or Alzheimer's. So we're looking at the root causes and then pathogens, toxins, as I mentioned, nutrition, hormones, trophic factors, immune response, all these things, and addressing those things specifically for each person. And so we're looking at their cognition at 0, 3, 6, and 9 months. There's also a more sensitive online cognitive assessment. So the good news, you put those together, you now have a bigger dynamic range where you can look at people who are mildly affected or more affected. Then we also look at, what does the partner say? Because there have been some drug trials in the past where there were barely statistically significant effects, and yet the partners couldn't tell any difference. We want to know if the partner can also tell that there's a change in the person. And so we want to look at that over time. And then finally, we want to look at their MRI scans to see, have they gotten worse? Have they gotten better? What's happened? And this is just to show data, for example, from the online cognitive assessment where you can see that people get better. And interestingly, right in here or so was when the pandemic started. So you can see a few people stopped doing what they were supposed to be doing, actually. Despite that, looking at the whole group, they in fact improved, and this was a statistically significant improvement. So just to summarize, for time reasons, I'm just going to summarize what came out of this trial. This is publicly available. It's posted on medRxiv. And so you can see here, by Montreal Cognitive Assessment, 76% of the patients actually improved. Didn't simply slow their decline, they actually improved their cognition. Their NCI, the more sensitive online assessment, showed that 84% of these people had improved. These are both statistically significant results. The subtests improved: verbal memory, executive function, psychomotor speed, cognitive flexibility, and others as well. And then the partners could actually tell as well. The partners knew that, yes, they actually did improve. And interestingly, their brain training scores improved in all of the patients. And perhaps most importantly, the MRI. And of course, the MRI, there's no placebo effect in an MRI. So these were people who showed improvements. Their gray matter volume. Now, your gray matter volume, if you have MCI or if you have Alzheimer's disease, it actually reduces by about 2.5% per year on average. If you have no symptoms, if you are a normal aging person, it still goes down slightly. But in this particular trial, these people, despite the fact that they had MCI or Alzheimer's, actually went up. Their gray matter got slightly larger. And then their hippocampal volume, again, goes down rapidly, about 4.5% per year. If you have Alzheimer's, it goes down more slowly. If you have about 1.7% per year, if you don't have any symptoms. So for those of us who are just normally aging, these people, again, despite having a diagnosis, theirs actually, they went slightly down, but not even down as much as someone who is a normal aging person. So their MRIs were really quite interesting and really supported everything else that was done. So the point here is that we can at this point make Alzheimer's a former scourge. I think most of us didn't wake up this morning worrying about leprosy or worrying about polio. These are scourges of the past. People used to wake up worrying about these all the time. And in fact, we're going to go the same direction with Alzheimer's. And if we can get people to come in earlier, we can get people to look at the right things and get on appropriate prevention or early reversal, that's exactly what we can do. The time has come for us to make this a former scourge. So let me turn it over to Kat. As you know, we do the theory side, and Kat does the practice side, and she has tremendous experience with many clinical trials. So we're really fortunate to have her involved. I'm going to stop sharing the slides here and turn this over to her.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for having us. We're really excited to be able to share this topic that we're so passionate about, and you know, getting out our message really that dementia is a treatable and a reversible condition. One thing I want to say is I'm going to be talking fast because I have so much to tell you, but I sometimes use the terms dementia and Alzheimer's interchangeably. Alzheimer's is one type of dementia. There's multiple types of dementia, but in general, our approach to treating the dementias in our initial investigative approach is going to be the same as far as investigating, discovering, but I may interchange those two phrases. Today, I'm going to talk to you definitely as an Alzheimer's researcher and a clinician, but first I want to talk to you as a patient. I'd like to tell you a little story about how I came to first understand myself how to use a functional medicine or a precision medicine approach to reverse and unravel dementia. So 12 years ago, when I turned 50, I actually developed dementia. I was running my clinical trials research center. I did over 100 different pharmaceutical trials. I had done at least 20 long-term trials for Alzheimer's. And I started to realize that I had become as cognitively impaired as some of the patients in my trials. And I would give my patients 3 words to remember when I was testing their short-term memory on the Mini-Mental Status exam. And I couldn't remember the words when I would go to ask my patients a few minutes later. I had 2 sets of words that I had used for, you know, over 20 years at that point. And I had to write them down in order to ask the patient the correct response. So that was a big clue to me as far as how far I was struggling. But I started having problems with all kinds of different things with my brain. I started having trouble saying the right words. Sometimes I would say the wrong word and I just couldn't articulate what I wanted to say. I started having problems driving my car. And I actually I lost the ability to back up my car or parallel park my car. I just couldn't sequence those complex visual spatial things. And I would try to parallel park and I couldn't do it. And I'd try again and finally just go look for another parking place because I couldn't do it. And one day my husband was in the car with me and he said, "Cal, what's wrong with you? You're like a little old lady." And I said, "I don't know. There's just so many things happening when I'm driving." driving, and my processing speed was so impaired that I just couldn't integrate all those things quickly enough to drive. And now, mind you, I wasn't thinking at that time of my processing speed or my visual spatial sequencing. I was just trying to function because my functioning every day was getting more and more difficult. I developed trouble using a computer, and I would ask my husband to show me how to do things on a computer that I used to know how to do. And he would get annoyed because he'd say, "Kat, I just showed you that." And I didn't even remember that he had just shown me. I had trouble dialing phone numbers. Sometimes I would have to try over and over to get the phone number, and I certainly couldn't hold those 7 numbers in my head the way I used to. And it just kept getting worse. I developed auditory processing problems. I was having a really hard time hearing, and I kept going to the ENT doctor, and that's the ear, nose, and throat doctor here in the US. I'm not sure what you call them in the UK, but I kept going and saying, "I need some hearing aids." And he told me, "You just have a mild hearing loss. You don't need hearing aids." And then I had a horrific experience one night, a horrifying experience. I was having dinner with some friends, and suddenly I realized I could not understand what they were saying. I would just get a snatch of every word, and I could not participate in that conversation. So I marched right back over to the ENT doctor. I said, "Just give me the hearing aids. I need to try them." And he looked at me funny, and he said, "Kat, the problem isn't in your ear, it's in your brain." And so, what had happened was my brain could no longer properly decode the sounds that were coming in through my ears. And in a nutshell, I had developed dementia. My brain was degenerating, and all these things were happening. But who thinks of dementia in a 50-year-old? Well, let me tell you that now, 12 years later, we are seeing more and more people with dementia coming in their 50s and 60s. But back then, it was still pretty rare. And I sort of only retrospectively, as I finally got to the point where I could no longer work, figured out that this is dementia. At the time, as I mentioned, I was just trying to survive, and my brain was letting me down. So the secret to reversing things for me came from understanding all of the different factors that were causing that. I had all kinds of things going on. I had developed an autoimmune disease and developed multiple chemical sensitivity. I had become allergic to everything. I was covered with rashes and hives, and I had severe fatigue, and I could barely get out of a chair for a year. And if I could get out of a chair and go to a store, the smells would give me more rashes and hives, and I would have more brain fog, and my brain would be worse. So I've treated enough patients with dementia to know that when you get dementia in your 50s, it often progresses much more rapidly than the later onset dementias that we see. And I feel like if I hadn't discovered functional medicine 11 years ago, I feel like, I would have been drooling in a nursing home a long time ago, or possibly not even around anymore. So I'd like to tell you a little bit of what I learned to reverse my dementia, and then what I and others in my team and my research groups and study groups are all doing to reverse dementia. And one of the things that I want to say is that the things that we're doing to help people reverse their dementia are also things that you should be aware of for preventing the dementia. Okay, let me go on to my slides here. So the first point that I really want people to understand is that dementia is both preventable and treatable when we can find the correct underlying causes. And dementia is not a death sentence. That's, of course, what we're all taught to believe. Get your affairs in order. You might have 10 years, but this is going to go. And it's not a death sentence. Dementia is a neurodegenerative disorder, but it's not really a mysterious, untreatable brain disorder. It doesn't just happen. It's a potentially reversible multi-system illness, as Dr. Bredesen told us. It's multiple things, and it occurs due to toxins and infections and inflammation and lack of hormones, lack of nutrients, and diet and lifestyle factors. And it also has a strong autoimmune component as well. So it happens for reasons. And when we can discover all of these various reasons, and we do need to look at, you know, everything that's happening, those 36 holes in the roof that have now come to more holes than that, then we can find the treatment targets that are going to help us to reverse this degenerative process. So Alzheimer's is multifactorial. It's almost never due to just one thing. Occasionally it's just one thing, but here on the slide, you can see some of the various contributing factors. There may be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, like somebody has surgery with general anesthesia. We know that's a risk factor for dementia as we age. And suddenly they manifest with very clear memory problems, but all of these other factors that you see here on the slide were happening before then. So metabolic factors like the lipids, the high blood pressure, the high blood sugar, the obesity, nutritional deficiencies, vitamin and nutrient deficiencies, toxins like heavy metals and chemicals, things that cause inflammation, infections, autoimmune diseases, chronic stress. We know that chronic stress can degenerate the hippocampus, which is the memory center in our brain. Head trauma certainly can cause degeneration, and then withdrawal of trophic support like hormones and key nutrients. Now, when we can find all those underlying causes and restore all the factors that the brain needs, like the hormones and the key nutrients, then we can call upon various modalities to enhance our neuroplasticity. So there's been a lot of work with researchers in the past and currently, you know, looking at all the different ways that we can rewire our brain and make new connections in our brain. When I was in medical school in the 1980s, we were taught that by age 18, you had all the neurons you were going to have. And after 18, it was just going to be downhill from there. Well, that's a pretty dismal picture, but thank goodness it turned out to be wrong. And they've done studies now that can show even up into the time of death, when people are, you know, terminally ill and older, they can do scans and look at the metabolic activity of their brain and show that they can still make new synaptic connections even late in life at the time of death. So the neuroplasticity is basically the innate ability that our brains have to reorganize, recode, make new neuronal connections in response to learning, you know, and after injuries. So anything that stimulates the brain can help neuroplasticity to occur. And some of the best validated things that we know are exercise and meditation. And those are things that everybody can do for free. They don't cost money. You know, you can incorporate those into your life. And I do personally think that daily exercise is one of the best hedges that we have against the aging with our bodies and our brains. But neuroplasticity could be a whole long talk. So let me keep going on here and tell you about this approach. Functional medicine and precision medicine are you know, pretty similar terms for the same thing. And functional medicine is a fairly new paradigm of medicine, and it seeks to uncover the root cause of the illness. So if we can uncover and reverse the underlying cause, then we can restore the system back to balance and into health. And so with functional medicine, instead of making a diagnosis and giving a medication to treat the symptoms, functional medicine wants to know why. Why does the person have this disease? What is the cause that led up to the development of the disease? And what factors are continuing to drive the progression of the disease? So if we want to halt dementia, we have to utilize all of the various factors that we learn in our functional medicine training. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the approach. And I really particularly want to highlight a couple of the factors that drive dementia that I think a lot of people are missing. So I tend to think of what I do with my patients in their dementia protocols is the 3 R's. First, I want to remove, replace, and regenerate. So I want to remove all the factors that are weakening or hurting the body and the brain. I want to replace any nutrients or B12 and their vitamin D and, you know, various other things that we look at with the vitamins, the minerals, and then, you know, the hormones, which I'll say a little bit about a little later. And then once we can remove and replace, then we also want to continuously work on regenerating and bringing the brain back to health. So let me say a little bit about senior moments. These are some of the things when people start feeling like they are having some trouble with their memory. And I find when people have an intuitive sense that they're beginning to have problems with their memory, they are. So people might start having trouble with finding the right words that they want to say. They might find themselves saying the wrong word, as I found myself doing at 50. They might have trouble forgetting people's names that they should remember, or they drop the ball on things that they should have, they would have normally taken care of. Sometimes they start to forget the details of recent travels or important events. They can start misplacing or losing things. They can start having trouble with directions or going to familiar places. And we see that sometimes people can become overly reliant on their GPS, even in a familiar place that they shouldn't have to use it. They might have trouble with math, like calculating a tip. And recipes are a really good pickup, you know, to cook and follow a recipe, and all the timing and the things that happen is a very actually high level executive function. And recipes can start to seem stressful, or people can just have a global sense of overwhelm. So when you're having a memory problem, you go to your doctor and you say, okay, I think I'm having a problem with my memory. And what does the doctor say? Well, they usually tell you, oh, don't worry about it. This is normal. Everybody has some changes in their memory with aging. Well, I strongly disagree with this. And as I said, what I found is when people feel like they're starting to have trouble with their memory, they actually are. And that's the term that that Dale told us, subjective cognitive impairment. So you think you're having cognitive impairment, but the doctors will often tell you, oh, it's not much, don't worry about it. So I want to highlight a quick case of one of my patients who came to me in the study. He was tested several years ago when he was 60 years old. And this was a physician and an inventor, and he was the head of a startup company, and, you know, very highly educated gentleman. And he said, I'm having trouble with my memory. So they tested him at Kaiser, and you can see the test scores on the left. And what they told him, oh, you know, don't worry about it. Most of your tests are fine, and there's only one that's a little bit off. And you should just, you know, you should try to work on your diet and your exercise. And you can see there that the delayed memory score was in the 18th percentile. Well, the way you think about that is 50th percentile is an average intelligence. So here is somebody that's highly educated, and he certainly should be way over the 50th percentile, but we're seeing him come in at the 18th percentile. So they told him, you know, just exercise and reduce stress. And so he felt reassured. And what did he do? Nothing. So he continued to decline. And then 3 years later, at age 63, he presented for our dementia trial. And at that point, he actually met the, you know, clear criteria for mild cognitive impairment. And then when we did the testing, I don't know if you can see the whole slide with the pictures here, but when we did the testing for our trial, at that point, the verbal memory had declined to the 7th percentile. So that's more than a 50% decline in his memory over that 3-year time, when there was a big window that a lot of things could have been done to prevent his decline. And we, you know, a lot of valuable time was lost. And at that time, his brain was still degenerating. But I want to tell you that at the end of our 9-month trial, his verbal memory that started at the 7th percentile was up to the 92nd percentile. So way better than normal. So we were able to reverse that. So I just have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about a couple of the factors that I think people are missing when working with dementia. So all general health starts with the diet, the exercise, adequate sleep, stress reduction. And this is the first step that many people, when they present with dementia, or now people are opening their eyes and saying that these things all matter. And so of course they matter. But there's some factors that I think people are missing. And the big factors that turn up for us over and over are the role of infections in the brain, the role of toxins in the brain, the lack of hormones, and also immune issues. So let me just show you this quick list of infections. I'm not going to talk about all these, but these are some of the biggies that we look for and test for. And you can see at the bottom of my list here, I added COVID. So COVID, we know, is causing brain fog. It's causing neurocognitive problems, and it's causing an inflammation in the brain. And so we're expecting that for some people, we're seeing chronic problems, and we're expecting that there's going to be some longer term brain problems related to that. But it's showing the world the role of a virus and what it does to the brain, which, you know, hasn't been widely accepted before now. Oops, let me go on. Lyme disease just deserves a special mention. Lyme is a spirochete like syphilis. It's the same class of organisms as syphilis. And we know that syphilis, before we had antibiotics, would get in the brain and cause people down the road to go crazy. So the Lyme disease is just becoming more and more ubiquitous, and certainly over time, even acutely and over time, it can cause dementia. And there was a recent paper of a woman who was treated for Lyme disease. She went on to die from dementia, and they did an autopsy of her brain, and they found there were live spirochete organisms in her brain. So even though her blood test made it look like her Lyme had been adequately treated, it was still there. So this is one that we really need to have a heightened awareness of. Toxins are a big thing: chemical toxins, industrial pollutants, air pollution, the wildfires that we're having here in Northern California, the toxic chemicals that we put on our hair and our skin, and perfumes and household cleaning products. All of these chemicals are known to accumulate in the brain and trigger the brain to produce more of the amyloid that Dale mentioned and start destroying things. Hormones, I just want to say a special word about. Our brain is full of hormone receptors. We think of these hormones like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone as sexual hormones, but they're so important that our brains actually make their own supply of estrogen and progesterone. And so there's receptors all over our brain for all of these hormones here that you see. And they're there because our brain needs those hormones to function. So, you know, before the last century, we didn't live that long past menopause or andropause. And so it wasn't that relevant that our hormones were declining. But now, you know, with our baby boomer generation, this is the longest lived generation. And, you know, we could live a quarter to a third of our life after menopause or andropause. And if we don't have these hormones that our brain needs to function, it's going to start degenerating. And there's a large body of evidence that's been around for quite a while, showing the effects of taking away the hormones and what happens with neurodegeneration. So that's one of the things that we measure, all of these hormones. We work with them all, and we try to put them into balance for people, and we can see some dramatic responses for some people with the hormones. Immune function is another factor. And so, you know, aging is often accompanied by a decline in immune function, and stress also can suppress our immune function. And what happens when our immunity is suppressed is that some of those viruses that I showed you on the earlier slide, they live in our bodies, and our immune system keeps a lid on them and keeps them from causing trouble for us. But when our immunity is suppressed, and that can just happen with general aging, then these viruses can wake up and reactivate. And all those viruses that I showed you on that previous slide, we know like to live in the brain. And even some infections like the Lyme disease is known to suppress the immune system. So that can make things worse. So when we have things triggering our brain, the immune system responds by making these inflammatory cytokines to kill these invading infections. And those inflammatory cytokines, which we've learned about, everybody has learned about with COVID now, we need them to kill things in the short term, but with chronic problems, they can cause so much neuroinflammation that it's going to destroy the healthy brain cells. So supporting the immune system becomes one more arm of what we do. It's so important to cast a wide net with the testing. So I feel like with dementia, we have no time to lose. And, we want people to be better yesterday. So we jump into testing all of these various things as rapidly as we can so that we can figure out what are our treatment targets. And there's often multiple things that we're working with each patient that we need to address. But if we address all these things, we can stop this neurodegenerative process. And so again, some of the things here, I just don't have time to go into everything, but the infections, the toxins, the mold. I know, and I've heard in the UK that the mold is a huge problem because at least in London, it's of course a very old city and older homes, and the damp and the humidity, but definitely a very large number of patients in our clinical trial did have some problems with mold in their home environments that we were able to look at with our testing and see were affecting their brains, and working with cleaning that up, the environment, giving people binders to help get rid of those mycotoxins in their body. There's things that we can do to reverse that. So the hormones, the thyroid, immune function, blood sugar control, we know that high blood sugar, that's been known for a long time, that high blood sugar is destructive to our blood vessels and in our body and our brain. The lipids, the high lipids, anything that causes inflammation and clotting factors, lack of oxygen, all of these things we want to address. So I'm going to leave you here with, this is kind of my basic dementia protocol in a nutshell. And I won't read all these things because I'm running out of time, but some of the things that we do in our working with people as we do the testing. And of course, we want to get people on a proper diet. We've had a lot of success using a ketogenic diet, and that's a whole other talk, but time restricted eating, compressing the timing of the eating into a 10 to 12 hour window of a day actually will allow people to get into a ketogenic state for many people, and that does various things in the brain to help. Exercise, mindfulness, doesn't have to be traditional meditation, but any kind of mindfulness to turn off your brain, decrease your stress. Brain training, there's various things that we do. Of course, assuring adequate sleep, checking for sleep apnea is critical, and optimizing all of the hormones. And then, of course, supplements that we use for addressing all of the deficiencies. So I just would like to leave you with my favorite statement. This is my big takeaway, that I really want people to come out of our talk knowing that dementia is not a death sentence. There are so many things that we can do to help people figure this out. And so I'm going to leave it there, and I'm sure we have some questions, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Kat. That was amazing. And Dale, that was amazing. You guys are so inspiring, and really, really grateful for your time. And I'm sure everybody here is. So there are quite a few questions that have come in. We don't have much time to answer them, so I'll try and summarize. There are a few that are actually in common. So I think one of the key questions that's come up a couple of times is on HRT, people asking whether HRT, hormone replacement therapy, would be helpful in preventing. So I'll let both of you decide who's going to answer that.
Yeah, I'll let Kat go ahead because she's an expert in this area.
There was a really great study that Stanford did a few years ago, and they took women that were at higher risk for dementia and had been on hormone replacement therapy, and they randomized them either to stay on their hormone replacement therapy or stop it, and they followed them for 2 years. And they did head scans and neuropsych testing, and what they found at the end of 2 years was that 100% of the women who stopped their hormones had a decline in not only in their cognitive testing, but they had enough of a decline that it could be picked up on their head scans. So to me, that is such a compelling statement. And it didn't matter whether they were on synthetic hormones or bioidentical hormones. And certainly these days, we want all our patients on synthetic hormones. We want estrogen in particular transdermally through the skin. where it doesn't go through first pass in the liver and create metabolites that cause cancer. We've all been scared by the different studies that have been done in the past with hormones telling us they cause cancer. Those were all done with synthetic hormones, and now we have bioidentical hormones that actually are showing, the data is showing that they can be protective from cancer. And there's several studies showing that after breast cancer, giving the hormones back is going to decrease the risk of recurrence of the breast cancer. So I have breast surgeons here in my area that are letting their patients go back on their hormones once the cancer is gone. You don't want them while there's a cancer, but they certainly don't cause cancer. And we just have a more and more body of data that they're trophic for the brain. And we see it sometimes, put people on hormones, and some people within just very short order will immediately tell you how much better their cognition is.
That's great. And that makes a lot of sense. 2 questions also on trials, how to participate in trials. Are you taking anyone? And if so, how do people apply?
Yes, but in the areas where the physicians are. So we have 6 different sites for this second go round. So there will be a site in Oregon, 2 in the Bay Area. There will be a site that just outside the Bay Area, Sacramento, and then 1 in Cleveland and 1 in Southern Florida.
Okay, that's great. So you're out of luck if you're living in the UK.
Well, and that's hopefully that, once we got through this next study, we'll, be able to bring in funding and do bigger widespread studies. So we've just done the first proof of concept trial. We've showed that this method worked, and now, we're going to replicate it. And in the second trial, we're going to have a control arm. So people are going to be randomized either to the active treatment with the precision medicine, functional medicine approach, or they're going to be randomized to receive standard of care neurology treatment. Which is a handout saying diet, exercise, sleep, see you in a year, but except that we will still see them and do all of our testing. And then at the end of our trial, we're going to offer the people in that arm active treatment. So they will definitely get the benefit. So that's the plan for the upcoming one, but we'd love to have more funding to do larger numbers of people and more widespread trials. Certainly they're needed.
They're very.
We've trained over 2,000 physicians in 10 different countries and all over the US. So there are people in the UK and there are people in Europe that are doing this. So certainly outside of the trial, this is available today.
Yeah. And Dr. Bredesen's training institute is called Apollo Health. And they do have a find a practitioner option there, so we can try to. I believe I've given some resources that can be put, with the recording of this talk for people to be able to find practitioners in their area.
I think that makes sense. And also on the Mindhealth 360 website, I have Bredesen listed physicians and other resources around functional medicine. And another question that's come in that's linked to that is, what sort of tests would you recommend? If there are no symptoms, are there any tests? And we know that there are a whole number of tests, and how do you get those tests? In the UK. And again, that's something that you can work with a functional medicine physician, and there are these resources, but please do address that as well.
And as Kat said earlier, prevention is very similar to reversal. It's a little easier, but it's the same idea. We want to know what pathogens, what inflammagens you've been exposed to. We want to know what your status is with respect to your metabolism. Do you have insulin resistance? This is such a common problem. And it is unfortunately one of the critical contributors, as Kat said earlier. What happens, our brains are basically run on 2 things. They either run on glucose or ketones. And unfortunately, as we get older and as we begin to have SCI, they lose both of those. So you lose the ability to utilize the glucose. And in fact, that's what the PET scans show, that you don't utilize the glucose appropriately in your temporal and parietal lobes. Indeed, that is the signature for Alzheimer's and pre-Alzheimer's. On the other hand, you can use ketones from burning fats. Well, what happens, you also don't develop those. When you have insulin resistance, you don't make and utilize ketones. So you literally, as Kat just said, this is essentially an emergency. You're coming in. This is something you cannot sit around. People will continue to go downhill. So you need to restore those, and that needs to include, how do you get them there? Blood flow. You have to have oxygen to burn them. So you have a whole set of things for energetics that are underappreciated, I think, by many in the medical community to get optimal cognition. This is why we want to look, for example, at sleep apnea, a common contributor to cognitive decline. So these are all critical pieces to make it so that you've got best outcomes.
That's great.
So, to tag on to that, I mean, we used in our study, and then we use it clinically, a neuropsych battery that's an online neuropsych battery called CNS Vital Signs. And it's a 45-minute to 60-minute test that looks at all the different domains of functioning cognitively that excuse me, a full day neuropsych battery would look at. But it can actually be given online or in the clinician's office. And so it's something that the UK clinicians can get an account with CNS Vital Signs and then order it for their patients to do. So that's one step to, look at. And it's good to have that as a baseline. Like, as Dale said, the cognoscopy at age 50. Well, when people come in at 60 or 70, I get that test, but I don't know what their functioning was before they had a problem. I can surmise from, like, the gentleman that I said was, a physician and an engineer, that I expect he's going to have a fairly high IQ, and I can tell when there's a huge drop. But if we have that as a baseline, and then we can look at it a year later, 2 years later, when somebody's struggling and see what's happening. And we also, then we see those scores go up and up in our patients when we do full court press with this approach. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is with regard to the head scans. We didn't really get to mention this, but what we're doing many times with early cognitive problems, the MRI is read as normal. The radiologist says it's normal, or there's a little bit of atrophy here, no big deal. But what we're doing is what's called a volumetric MRI. We're using NeuroQuant or NeuroReader. NeuroQuant seems to be more readily available, so that's what we're generally using in our area. But the patient gets an MRI scan, but it's done slightly different. They take some extra cuts of the views that they're doing on the MRI, and they run it through the software program, and then it gives us a report of the volume or the sizes of all of the different brain structures. And so we can tell by looking at that, is there degeneration of these brain structures, or is there inflammation of these brain structures? So some things that are igniting the brain, like some of the infections and the mycotoxins, will create a lot of inflammation in the beginning, and we'll see those brain structures come larger than normal on that. So that volumetric NeuroQuant scan has been super helpful for people where the doctors say, no, there's nothing wrong with you, it's all in your head. Well, you get the NeuroQuant and you can see that there's things wrong on that scan. So that's one other way that we're picking up earlier problems for people.
That's great. Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I just have a couple more questions. One of them, which is quite interesting, is, does this research also apply to Parkinson's?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're interested then in the laboratory. Our interest was, what is the phenomenon of neurodegeneration and how does it work? And the conclusion we reached after 30 years is that there is a mismatch for each of these diseases. There is a neural subsystem, and Kat talked a lot about neuroplasticity, which is the critical part of Alzheimer's disease. You're laying down new synapses, or you're now removing those. In each of these different diseases, macular degeneration, Parkinson's, Lewy body, progressive supranuclear palsy, you just go right down the list. Each of these has a different neural subsystem, and each of those subsystems has its own Achilles heel, has its own requirements. So it's a supply and demand. And we've now started something called the ARC project, where we're looking at these others as well, just beginning a couple of patients for each one, but looking at these larger data sets, as Kat had mentioned before. You've got to look at all these different things. Now in Parkinson's, it is a different system. In that case, it is a motor control subsystem. And the Achilles heel of that one happens to be mitochondrial complex 1. So in other words, that is an energetic related disease that is brought about typically by exposure to toxins or exposure to some of the pathogens that Kat was mentioning earlier. So there is a little bit of overlap, and in fact, Lewy body disease is basically Parkinson's plus Alzheimer's. So each of these has a different setup and a different subsystem. And so the idea is the same, but the specifics are modified for each of these different diseases.
That's great. And then another,
We're definitely seeing success. And we do have a study group with a group of us that, you know, share resources and papers and clinical experiences. And definitely we're all seeing success, not across the board with all of these other types of dementia yet or degenerative disease, but we all have success. I definitely have a Parkinson's patient that I've worked with for several years using this kind of approach, and have been really pleased that she, you know, has been quite steady.
Okay, and then finally, there's a question about whether dementia is inherited, and we haven't really spoken about the genetic component. And that also, I will just link that very quickly to the questions about testing and about where to get help, how to get on the trials, how to find more resources. And what I'll suggest, because we're running out of time, is I will actually give you my email, which is Kirkland, KIRKLAND @mindhealth360.com. And I can answer all those questions in terms of the tests, how to find practitioners, and, you know, and also there's one person who wants to come and participate in the trials, even though they are in California. So I will make sure that I address those. But back to the question about whether dementia is inherited, because I know that there's a test about that you can tell us about.
Yes, critical question. And in fact, only 5% of Alzheimer's is truly familial Alzheimer's disease. And that's 3 different gene mutations. It's APP, the one I showed you earlier, presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. Those are the big 3. But again, that's the rare case. For 95%, what's inherited typically is the risk. And this is why it's so important, as Kat was saying earlier, it's your proclivity to get the disease that you're inheriting. It's not the disease itself. So there is a lot you can do about it, both on the prevention and the reversal. About a quarter of the population has ApoE4, a specific allele of this ApoE gene. 3/4 of the population. So for the people without that, their chance during their lifetime, about 9%. Not too high. Single copy of ApoE4, that's about a quarter of the population, almost a quarter of the population. They have a 30% lifetime risk. And if you have 2 copies, and that's about 2% of the population, you are well over 50%. Most likely you will get Alzheimer's disease. So it's important for people to find out their ApoE status. That's part of the cognoscopy, by the way. And so then you can get on appropriate prevention or earliest reversal.
Fantastic. Well, that's super helpful. And obviously the other...
Kiki, and I know in my cohort of my 10 patients in the study, 50% of them did not have an ApoE4 gene.
Right.
So, you know, for starters, I just need people to know that it's not inevitable. When you have an ApoE4 gene, it's not inevitable. Many people die with ApoE4 and don't get Alzheimer's. It's the diet and lifestyle things that turn on that gene to express the extra amyloid that's going to kill your brain. So it's all, you know, treatable, and it's all preventable. But definitely we're seeing plenty of people that have problems with toxins and infections that don't have any ApoE4 genes at all. So don't think you're off the hook if you don't have it. But, you know, look at all of these factors, because, you know, we have people that are double E4s that are doing well and you know, live long and healthy lives.
I think that's true. And, you know, I would just, again, recommend these fantastic books. Dale has 2 amazing books about how to end Alzheimer's. One of them is a very practical, his latest is a sort of how to implement this program. So for a lot of the questions which are about how do we actually do this and how do we, you know, implement this, they're in this book. Kat's coming out with this brilliant book, which will be also very how to, a very practical guide to how to implement these programs, which can sometimes seem slightly overwhelming because there's a lot you need to do in terms of diet and lifestyle, meditation and testing, etc. But the key is that the results are worth it, because this approach really works. And I can't thank you both enough for your time and for the inspiration that you give to all of us in terms of, you know, giving hope where really there has been very little hope in the past. And, you know, this stuff really works. And, you know, so thank you so, so much. And again, if people have, you know, further questions or want further information, feel free to email me. And thank you to the How To Academy, who's been wonderful at co-hosting this. And, you know, here's to the end of Alzheimer's. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you very much, Kirkland, and thank you, Esme.
Thank you.
Thank you, Esme. Take care.